Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me, in another episode of Beyond Data. Today, I'm here with Ellie Graeden, and I'm really excited she's here to chat with me. Dr. Ellie Graeden is a research professor at Georgetown in the Global Health Science and Security department. She's got a long history of doing lots of other things. Today, we're going to have a lot of fun talking about discussing the availability, regulation, and policy of data as it's needed to make really important, quick decisions, and how the struggles of that, what they look like, and all kinds of things. And Ellie has like the perfect amount of kind of experience to really get in the weeds with us about that. So maybe, Ellie, to begin with, can you give us a sense of, looking at all the work that you've done is like awesome and impressive. Can you give us a sense of the different kinds of, because you've given me a couple of examples of work that you've done that I'm like, damn, that's a hard challenge. And it really kind of brings it to light. And maybe give us a sense of who you are and a little quick on your background. That'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. And thank you so much for the invitation, Tessa. It's a pleasure to be here. So as Tessa just said, I'm Ellie Graeden, but I have a PhD in biology, wet bench biology, but at the core of it, biology is a complex systems problem. And it's a complex systems problem where you're integrating data across a lot of different layers of resolution. And there has to be a generated outcome at the end. Mm-hmm. And what I was really interested in is getting all of these data that are used in the scientific communities and developed in the scientific communities, in the modeling communities, actually used in the real world.
Oh, yeah.
So I got pulled into the sort of life sciences and consulting space, the policy consulting space, but really very rapidly went into emergency management, which is this very interesting space where you're working with a lot of very intensive computational data. The National Hurricane Center models, for example, are still written in Fortran.
You're kidding.
Oh, no, not at all. And somehow you have to go from those Fortran models all the way out to an Excel calculator, for example, that calculates how much debris is going to be deposited behind the floodwaters left behind that hurricane.
Sure.
And that's a data translation problem. And the people who are using those data, to use the language you were just describing, these are high consequence decisions that have to be made very rapidly by people who are very, very good at what they do, very smart, but probably are not an expert in Fortran or hurricane modeling, and probably, may or may not be actually an expert in debris per se, but they're responsible for coordinating. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of, really at the core of it, in every case, what you're working with is computational data in operating in a policy or governance environment. So you have a lot of policy constraints and sort of governance constraints. Who's in charge? Who's allowed to be in charge? Who's allowed to make decisions? Who's paying, right? Which is your policy decision. And then what the operational practical realities are, right? So one of the things we ended up calculating was, based on the coastal flood modeling, the hurricane or the riverine flood modeling, and the displacement of vulnerable populations in the communities affected by that flooding, how many pallets of water needed to get loaded on the C-17 from the distribution center in Texas to be sent in or flown in, right?
This seems like such an easy thing. Like I think, it's like just put a lot of water on the plane, but it's clearly a lot more complex than that, right?
Well, it's more if you ask your standard flood modeler what the answer is to that, they will tell you that there are 2 or 3 orders of magnitude of error on the output of it.
Wow.
Turns out if you go back to your RV specialist in Texas and you say, so 10 pallets of water plus or minus 2 orders of magnitude of error, and the error on this one is, we'll call it 6 bottles of water.
Oh, no.
They're going to look at you and say, I'm sorry, how many pallets? When I say it's a translation problem, it's as much a human translation problem as it is as a data translation problem. Sure. The same thing ends up happening in a policy domain. So I should say, got my PhD, did the life sciences consulting, started my own company. So a lot of these stories are coming out of
Sure.
a company that I ran called Talus Analytics. We designed and built 25 different products, give or take, in the last 7 or 8 years. The idea was problems at that intersection that I was just talking about, the sort of computational data and scientific analysis, policy and governance, and practical operations. And designing and building the tools that could actually do both the data integration across those systems, but also then the visualization and communications of the results for the people who needed to be making those high consequence decisions. Subsequently, just since this last fall, transferred over to Georgetown at the Center for Global Health Science and Security, working with a team that I had been closely collaborating with for a lot of years on the policy side.
Right.
So that's sort of that arc there. But yeah, so these stories, there are many of them. Happy to dig in further.
Yeah. Well, and I know you also did, I think when I looked at your publications, you've done quite a bit on the COVID response, HIV propagation. You've done a lot of work in those arenas as well. And, it's just a broad spectrum of things. And, I think my first question is like, what do you see as the biggest barrier to any kind of quick decision making? Because I imagine, you even talk about that. You have first the data accumulation, which in itself I think can be incredibly difficult. And then when you start talking about data that needs to be HIPAA compliant or privacy issues, and then integrating that with policies, oh my goodness, it's like all these different barriers to be able to do something that we need to be able to do quickly. So can you speak a little bit to the biggest barriers and kind of what they look like for some of these things? And I know that might be too big of a question to start with, but
no, I work on large complex systems, right? And so the question itself is not too big, but also pretty clear actually in my mind, which is it's data sharing. You have to be able to really effectively move and communicate data that are relevant in ways that they can get used by people all across that system. So there's sort of, when we think about data policy, a lot of people, and certainly right now, the big emphasis is on privacy and security constraints. A lot of the data privacy certainly that we're hearing about is about how do we build data systems that meet the right for privacy, which is now is a foundational legislative basis, right? We don't actually in the US, we aren't able to write legislation that does not directly meet a right? Unless we can point back to the Constitution and say, see, we have a right for that. We actually can't write policy about it. So we have to be able to point to that right, which is part of the right reason that articulating the right to privacy has had such a big impact. And so we start to differentially discuss that. Suffice to say, though, that data sharing component ends up being really important because when we talk about rights, we can talk about individual rights, but there are also rights that are essentially only maintained through data sharing across communities. Public health is a great example of that. We protect health and liberty of the population without understanding if they're sick and what they're sick with. But those are highly constrained individual health data also. So there's this very sort of tactical rubber meets the road. How do you meet both of those rights or the requirements established by both of those rights without damaging the other? And the reality is a lot of our rights end up in conflict with each other in that sense, right? There's a lot of gray area between them. Think about freedom of speech versus right to privacy.
Of course. Right. Yeah.
It's a really big one. That's a very obvious one, but then you can start to get into those same issues. And those things are actually often legislated in the courts in practice, or they're sort of figured out in the courts. But that data sharing issue is the big linchpin, because if you don't, especially for senior level decision makers who are making high consequence decisions, they're moving very, very quickly. They need to have the right context, and they need to understand the pros and cons of the decision they're making. I worked with a guy at FEMA whose phrase was always, well, what's the so what? Right? So what?
Right. So what?
You can tell me what the data are. You can tell me what we're seeing, but at the end of the day, I need to know what I'm supposed to do about it.
Yeah. So is one of the biggest, so in the symposium that you just ran a couple weeks ago, I had heard someone talk about the importance of the intersection between and having engineers involved within the regulation and policy. And that kind of points to what you're talking about, right? Because you can't connect data without those things matching, right? Like, can you speak more about that, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. So one, I will almost always say that you should have cross-sector experts at the table for most things, right? Like that's
Sure.
a standard practice. The other is that if you're going to write a policy about or for a specific industry, you better have that industry part and parcel of the conversations, right? And there are a lot of examples where that has happened and has happened well, but there's always more to be done. And it turns out that just even having a conversation between engineers and lawyers requires a fair bit of translation. There's a lot of data. There is a lot of word usage that is very different between the two groups. Bias actually is a word that has a great example there. If you talk to
of like the different definitions of bias. Oh, interesting. So like a lawyer's definition and an engineer's definition. So yeah, what's the difference?
So if you talk to a statistician about what bias means.
Yeah. Well, that one I can kind of get intimately. Now I'm, yeah.
Right? And that bias means the model behaves predictably in one domain.
Right. Yeah.
Well, that means so that is what it is. But if you talk to anybody in the general public, including lawyers, they're going to tell you that it's the definition more akin to discrimination, right?
Yeah, right.
And that bias is about, it's the same core definition. It's that you get a response out from a system that is consistently falling in one domain. But the problem is that if that bias represents a racial bias or is differentially applied to groups in ways that we don't think they should be differentially applied, then that bias is a problem. But bias to a statistician is not a problem. It's simply a characteristic of the system. So those are just an example of the word choice there. I think then the real value of pulling the engineering community in is twofold. One is there's just actually the language difference. We can't actually move into regulations of engineering systems unless we're using the language that the engineers are using, at least to some degree, right? Because otherwise it can't be implemented in engineering spec. Secondly, though, there's actually a whole lot of work being done on the engineering side that has significantly moved past what we're regulating. So we can do things with engineering tooling that shift the priority for what and how we regulate those systems.
Yeah.
So one example is if we're talking about something like a VR headset, turns out so a lot of those VR headsets now have an AI chip on board, meaning they're in the single piece of hardware. What that actually means is that a lot of the data they're collecting is essentially ephemeral and never sent up to the cloud. Well, if it's never sent to the cloud and it's never stored and it's only being used and processed for internal immediate use for that one end user, the question is, to what degree do the consumer privacy laws like GDPR really need to apply to those ephemeral data or not?
Sure. Yeah.
And in which cases do they, in which cases don't they? But we can't even have that conversation right now because it's asserted that any data collected by that headset do fall under GDPR.
Right. I see. Yeah. But so, and this is where you shift, and I think I remember you referencing this before, the difference between regulating the generation of that data versus the outcome or the output of that data, where in this case, the output of that data would be that personal person's headset versus some other system on the cloud or in any other model that's being built for a more global or systemic sort of reason.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. And there's just not a good way to do differential regulation in that context right now.
Yeah.
So
I haven't even really heard it talked about quite that way. And like in what I have heard is like if the way the one like kind of through line that I can see in my role is things like federated learning, where you have the option to either train or deploy predictive models in almost isolation, as a way to kind of get around privacy issues and where the data moves. so to speak. But that's a little different than what you're saying in terms of accommodating that, right?
It is. So if I were to describe federated learning back to you in this context, basically what you're saying is that in each place that you're doing that federated learning, you're applying the regulatory constraints that are effective or applicable to that one specific domain. The results then are analyzed for their own security or privacy constraints, but then what is returned are only those data that meet the requirements of the data transfer, the API, coming out of that federated learning system.
Yeah.
If we're then thinking by contrast about the way that we would apply this sort of system, it's saying, okay, that's great. And also we need to recognize that we are trying to regulate all of data similarly here. And actually the way that GDPR is applied, a lot of I think some of these new laws are going to create some problems for the federated learning component, because you have to somehow that transition between the federated learning environment and then how those results are going to get used. If you actually have to be able to go back and say, delete my personal data out of every one of those federated learning examples, where you've kind of just broken that system, partly because you actually have broken the whole benefit with a federated learning model is you have a sort of veil of ignorance, if you will, term, between the data that we're working with up here and each individual federated learning environment. Well, if you actually have to be able to backtrack through it, you've actually now broken or pierced that veil. And I think that weirdly in conflict with what what the regulators are trying to accomplish. But the way the policy is written, that's actually what you then have to do in practice. So I think this is where that discussion with engineers matters a lot, because if we can articulate these mechanisms by which we can use engineering principles like federated learning, or like a lot of the different privacy enhancing technologies that are currently being worked in the engineering community, we can really effectively meet the outcome requirements that drive toward privacy, but that are currently not allowed in the innovative space, because what we're trying to do instead is over-regulate the process by which we get to those outcomes.
Right. And it almost seems like it gets back to, what does it mean to own your own data, to me, in my mind? And then also, like, the conflicting rights of public safety and health versus individual safety and health. Like, because that's kind of the through line we're sort of talking about here, right? Because if I own data, if I have personal data, it's one thing if me as an individual is used as a data point in a model of some sort that's used for some output that can't be traced back to me in any way or form. Is very different than my data being exposed as my data, as me as an individual person.
Yes.
And it seems like we're kind of almost trying to what I'm sensing in this conversation is the overregulation of that. What does it mean to have personal data? Like, is that my data, or is it the public's data, or is it, humankind's data for the sake of public safety? Interesting. Yeah. I get lost in my own brain as I'm starting to say it out loud, but that's how where it's leading me.
That's right. I mean, I think that's exactly right. And the way that I think about that, at least, is data are nothing more and nothing less than an abstract representation of the world around us. Mm-hmm. We are now at a point where every single thing we experience can be captured as data, right? And we're capturing those data all the time in myriad ways. When we experience the world, we are depositing a historical record. That has always been true.
Yeah.
It's now at a different scale, arguably.
Sure.
But it's still, it turns out that our actions in the world have always been traceable back to us.
Yeah.
And so the very idea that there is even ownership about information in the world, I think we need to get really careful about, because I think it's more, again, we can actually apply most of the regulatory frameworks that we already have in place and the rights protections that we already have in place work actually really quite well and can continue to work in these areas We just haven't actually applied them there. So, if we think about things like discrimination, housing discrimination, 'cause it's a really nice, easy one. We know you aren't allowed to discriminate in housing, right? The right here is health, pursuit of happiness, and basic, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like basic requirements. When we think about how we regulate that, we say, okay, you can't discriminate in your housing practices. I don't care whether you're a lender or whether you're a realtor, you can't be discriminatory.
Right.
And I don't care whether you get to an unbiased, equal housing market using a paper map and a red line or a red pen, right? You can't use that red pen.
Yeah, right.
or whether you use an AI model. You simply can't have a discriminatory housing market.
Sure. Yeah.
And so I think what we actually need to be doing here is saying, look, here's your outcome metric.
Right.
I don't care how you get there. And I think that's ultimately going to be really important because there's only so much. We can't actually go in and regulate technology ahead of really anything, ahead of when we know it exists, right? We know that's not the case.
Sure.
And if we set up a regulatory framework that is organized around the execution principles or the mechanisms by which you yield those outcomes, what ends up happening is that people use different mechanisms, right? They get around it.
Oh, right. Yeah.
The only way to solve that is to say, no, I don't care how you get there. You can't discriminate in housing.
Right.
Interestingly, the same thing applies to financial regulation. So financial regulation, anybody in the financial industry will tell you that it does not work terribly well, but from a layperson's perspective, at least, it works pretty darn well, right? Sure. I can go, anytime I go on any business trip to anywhere in the world, I can go to an ATM and get cash out.
Right.
So it's working reasonably well, right? But if we think about it there, what's fascinating is that those laws apparently haven't been applied to crypto.
Right. Oh, right.
Market. And the whole point of fraud detection in the financial market, and one of the core sort of principles of that regulation, is that you have to know who's sending money to whom, how much, when, and where, right? Like, it's really well designated and delineated. So crypto said, oh no, the whole point is that we never do that. And then are we surprised that there was global scale fraud on the system? We had a very hard time tracking. I mean, these are the sorts of things where it's like, no, actually, if we just simply applied a lot of these outcome-driven policies that are already in place and pretty well vetted, if we'd simply applied these to the same data and modeling systems that we have, actually, those outcome metrics are largely sufficient.
And if I think about that, like if I kind of reorient my brain to consider it that way, right? Where I'm like, okay, let's talk about outcomes, and then when that means going down and the issues that you see, I imagine it makes things kind of like even data integration more easy, because in these different secular units, right? Like finance data has very different, regulatory rules than HIPAA, right? And being able to, and I'm not saying we would globally, unrule all of those things, but it kind of allows for better mixing and collaboration of that information, because you're really orienting it to the end objective. And as long as that's been well vetted, then I get that's the point, right? Or that's part of it.
Well, and it allows you to treat data that effectively fall in two buckets differently for two outcomes, right? So what it says is, okay, let's go back to this VR headset example, right? So we can now do eye tracking. Quick side note, there's a paper from a long time ago that gets very, very heavily cited where they were able to use mouse movements. Software and hardware companies collect mouse movement data.
Sure.
And that's pretty critical. The system needs to know when you've clicked on something. Turns out that you can also diagnose Parkinson's disease almost 3 months before they could do it in the clinic.
Wow, that's impressive. That's crazy.
But what that means is that data that are currently being collected effectively as a consumer data product, right, which is what it's being used as and regulated as by these software and hardware companies,
right,
is also in practice health data, and certainly could be. And in some cases, you could argue it should be. So if you go back to the VR headset case, I have to imagine we will know, we being whoever is working with those data, would know if you have a stroke while you're wearing the headset.
Sure.
It's going to happen. The question is, what is the liability for what you do with those data? If you know, do you have to act on it? Do you have to treat it like health data? And if you're treating these data as health data, well, they have a very different set of regulatory constraints. And HIPAA isn't going to regulate those because it's not a healthcare provider and not a healthcare insurer.
Sure. Yeah.
They're really regulated that way, but we should arguably have some regulations that address it. Sure. So this is where the sort of merging of an overlap of the sort of industry-specific policy framework that we have right now is going to cause a lot of problems, because we don't differentiate well when these data can serve two different purposes. And so this gets all the way back to the data ownership issue, which is really well, hang on, what are data anyway? And what we're really worried about is how those data get used, like we are in most of the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Or most of the rest of the contexts of the world, right? Driving, health.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. And when you start to paint those pictures, it really starts to, for me, elicit this response of like human potential that we're not grappling with. Because, to your point earlier, the volume of data that we're generating now is just insane, right? And we really don't understand all that we can glean from it. And, we probably never will. But to know that even something like that is known, and then I'm sure there's not a vehicle for it to be used in any kind of meaningful way, which I imagine a lot of people would benefit from. And like the Parkinson's example is what I was thinking of, right? And, but I'm not sure how much, and that goes back again to the whole public rights controversy kind of, that I haven't actually thought about really, the public rights versus individual rights until this conversation, but it keeps getting woven in this conversation in my mind because of how this is emerging.
Yeah, it's a big one. Well, and in no way am I saying that we shouldn't have GDPR, shouldn't have HIPAA.
Right.
Argument. There's an and statement that needs to be shifting away from regulation of the data themselves or of the tools themselves toward primary regulation of the outcome associated.
Right.
And that allows us to get actually much greater and more diverse protection of our rights overall, because now you can actually expand the frameworks to include more rights and protect more rights in a much more specific way. Because instead of saying, okay, we're always going to regulate these data this way, which bounds our ability to differentially use them toward this right or toward that right.
So, and I imagine with all the work you did with COVID, I imagine you ran into something where this would have been an advantage, where you ran into some issues where this would have been an advantage. Can you describe at least one or maybe even two that you ran into while you were doing that work?
Yeah, there are actually two that I think are really helpful and useful in this context. So one is a pretty straightforward one, which is we needed to know, we were working really closely with Nevada Governor's Office. They were doing a great job of figuring out how to do vaccine rollouts. This was at a point where we had enough vaccine, but we were specifically worried about communities that were socioeconomically vulnerable, people who are still working two jobs and don't have time to get to a vaccine provider and probably may or may not have a primary care physician to get it from, right? So we were deploying vaccine vans the way that a lot of municipalities were. We needed to know where to put those vaccine vans. So to do that, we wanted to know, just by general neighborhood, zip code, whatever we could get, how many people have been vaccinated.
Right.
We can get basic socioeconomic vulnerability characteristics from CDC and from the census. So we have those data as well. The only vaccine registry that we had in the state is focused on state level vaccinations, which are oriented around the individual, right? What they're worried about is, hey, did Ellie receive her, chickenpox vaccine in time to go to school, right?
Right. Yeah.
So it's all the entire database, and it's a 2003 SQL database. When I said, got it, okay, that's what we're working with here. They said, well, it's not still in COBOL.
Well,
I mean, you're right. At least it's not still in COBOL. But the SQL database was keyed on the individual. You couldn't add the data. You couldn't go in and do a data pull without having HIPAA compliance.
Right.
It makes sense for why they built it, but those data were not available elsewhere. So that's one really good example where just thinking about the differential use of these data and structuring them so that you can access them for these different uses actually saves a lot of lives, right? This is not, we talk about privacy as, and a lot of times it sort of gets articulated as the single overarching right.
Yeah.
And what I will just assert is that, especially in things like health, what we're also talking about our life is life and death. And what we're talking about is in emergency management are lives for which someone is responsible.
So, but in that case, in order to change how that's done, that would have to be something that's regulated across different health systems, right? To do it differently. Is that how that would have to be rolled out? The way they store the information?
Right. So I think I'm thinking through what the right kind of policy would be there. So I think there are a couple of different solutions here. One is there's an engineering solution, right? Which is to either have a pre-canned extract that is generating population level aggregation, which would fall outside of the HIPAA constraints anyway, right? So as long as that's being done by the person who builds the data set, then it's fine. So I think just even being really clear about what those secondary use cases are and valid use cases are is helpful. That's sort of from an engineering design perspective. From the policy perspective, I think you can do something similar, which is to say, if you're using it for public health, here are the constraints on what the data need to be. And you can, right? And you can't access, share. Well, you can't share or use any data that fall outside of that bucket. And I think that's where we can probably, I'm going to get myself in trouble here, become slightly less restrictive on the data policies themselves, while if anything, actually being more restrictive on their use cases, on the outcomes. And I think that's actually where we get real value, is because what we say is, look, if you're going to use this for insurance, it's not that you can't have the data, right? But you're not allowed to use it. This gets back to the using discrimination example. Look, you could be discriminatory. You have plenty of information to be discriminatory. That doesn't mean you're allowed to be discriminatory. And that's, I think the same things then can be applied to a lot of these different systems, or that same kind of thinking. The second example where this is directly relevant is a large-scale system that we built up for CDC, looking at hospital and healthcare impacts from COVID-19.
Oh, like the bed, how many beds were opened up, those types of things?
Yeah, so that was the one that was run by Palantir. That's the one that everybody heard about. We were one that we'd actually started working on well before the pandemic. And we were focused on visibility for any types of impacts. So obviously, once we were into COVID, they were very, very focused on bed counts, patients, and supplies. Right. Things like vents early, masks early, then all the subsequent, right? What we were looking at was, look, we also need to know, we just need to know which hospitals are struggling for which reason. Because we were doing this in a much broader hazard context. We need to know when you're on evacuation status from wildfires in Northern California. We need to know when you're on evacuation status from a hurricane. And if you're on evacuation status, we need to know if that's because every road into your hospital is blocked, so you can't get people in and out, whether it's because you're on emergency power or because you're actually out of power at this point because you've run out of diesel.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And we also, by the way, need to know if you're out of capacity in your emergency room or in your emergency department, or if you're out of capacity in your ICU, right? These are the sorts of more patient level and COVID specific types of impacts. We need to know all. So what we did was we worked with a group of hospitals. They were sharing data with us for free because it was to their value to see each other's. And we
Sure.
worked with them to build a data integration system that translated their data into an apples to apples frameworks, so that no matter what we were looking at, whether it was facilities impacts, ability, emergency department overcrowding, we knew in a sort of, oh, if this hospital says they're having a bad day in this way, and this hospital says they're having a bad day in this way, that's relatively comparable.
Yeah, sure.
You just need to be able to, they need to be in the same ballpark.
Yeah.
In some cases, we were working with emergency department overcrowding scores. From other hospitals, we were pulling emergency operations center scores or emergency operations center data. In other cases, we were pulling billing data because it's all we had.
Oh, wow.
And then we had admissions, discharge, and transfer data from another group. So these are highly sensitive data that you don't talk nicely to each other normally. We ran a statistical, we set a statistical threshold for what constituted a bad day in any one of these categories.
Okay.
And then the only ones who were able to tell CDC which hospitals were on evacuation status from power outages during Hurricane Laura, who also had COVID patients. Because it turns out that due to a lot of these policy rules and the way that those policy rules have been implemented, patient level data never gets cross-referenced with facility level data.
Wow. Yeah.
Power outages in the same data system that you see patient overload,
right,
or patient overcrowding. And that's arguably a problem. You really need to be able to see those data together. So it is possible you can get creative about this, and you can do this in ways that actually do align with the current regulatory frameworks.
Sure.
But it's much more ad hoc. It's, this was us working with every single hospital system on a one-on-one basis to figure out what a reasonable statistical threshold was, right? This is not an immediately scalable system.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's a lot of work. Sounds like a ton of work.
It was. We did a few things during COVID.
Right? Yeah. Well, and that gets me back to one thing I know you had mentioned early on when we were talking, which was the integration of scientific data into, making it more broadly available. Because I imagine, yes, hospitals sharing data, and then I imagine there's also this pool that you'd want to be able to pull from for many different reasons. I mean, even that, right? Like being able to predict hazards or whatever within an overlay of that framework, because it's largely what you were doing, right? Kind of. Yeah. What do you think the main barrier to entry is for that, for the broad use of scientific data and information and shared, and being able to be used for these types of scenarios?
Effective translation. So good integration systems require aligned taxonomies and ontologies. People need to be using English the same way. And this is rarely, I should say, in my experience, the technical or engineering constraints can be solved. They can be solved. The human issues, how do we talk about it? How do we understand it? What language do we use to describe it? What does it mean to us? How do we feel about it? What are the cultural constraints with where we are or are not allowed to be wrong? Are we allowed to communicate uncertainty, or are we expected to communicate it? How do we communicate it? Right? Those are human issues. And we forget, I think, that data, again, I'm going to go back to this over and over because it really matters. Data are nothing more and nothing less than an abstract description of our world. Our world,
right,
is with humans who are communicating with each other, and they need to be able to do that effectively. Data is just one more sort of language with which we need to be able to communicate, and in which we need to be able to communicate, because it is a useful and powerful language that can tell us things that other languages don't. And we need a lot of different languages to be able to describe our experience in the world and our understanding of the world. So how do we do that? But we have to be thinking about how we use that language in concert with the other languages that we use.
Yeah. I mean, I see that. I mean, in my own world, I think that's one of the biggest challenges I have, which is a very different context, but just being able to transcend the technical application, whether it be math or engineering or coding or whatever, to the outcome, so to speak, to kind of align it to what we're talking about here. Is that kind of what you mean, where it's like, what is the scientific data even representing? It's like being able to transcend that kind of understanding. Is that largely what you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, and a very practical example of it is just what is the name that we put on the units on our graph?
Sure.
Right? I mean, we could talk about vaccinations, right? So vaccination is what we landed on. It's not just people. It's got to be vaccinated people. But we don't say people we've jabbed with a needle. Because that wouldn't go over well, right? And it's a silly example in that particular one, but actually this is a big deal. It turns out that, again, it's making sure that we are using words that resonate with the audience we need to use the data. And that may actually mean that we need to have two different versions of that graph that are the exact same data, but labeled with a different term. So a great example here from the emergency management side of things is that if you talk to Department of Energy about power outages, and they give you a number and they say, oh, we have 40% of our customers out of power in Florida. Again, we're talking about emergency management situations.
Sure. I get it. Yeah.
That doesn't actually happen. You can end up with very large numbers or percentages. But if you unpack that and you can say, okay, wait, so how many people are out of power? And they're like, oh, well, we have 40,000, we'll say, customers out of power. Hang on. What's customers?
Numbers don't make sense.
Well, those numbers don't make sense. I'm also making things up on the fly.
That's what you were going to say. I'm sorry. I missed
the numbers here are completely irrelevant.
Yeah.
What is a customer? Well, a customer to Department of Energy, because they're talking about electrical grid. Well, it turns out it's a meter.
Oh, right. Yeah, right.
That's how many people per meter. Oh, yeah, it's like 2.6. At least it was the last time we ran the calculation.
Okay.
So now if you ask how many people are out of power, you're off by 2.6.
Yeah.
An order of 2.6. And turns out when you talk to, say, HUD about sheltering and housing requirements, and you tell them, oh, we have 40,000 customers without power, they prep for 40,000 people.
Oh my goodness. Right. Yeah. Right.
So when we talk about this, we sort of think about this as a nice to have. It's like, no, actually, these words can mean a lot and they can make a huge difference. If you're preparing 2.6, a difference of, a multiplier of 2.6 is a lot of people who suddenly don't have meals or water.
Well, and then even in that example, right? Because I imagine, I guess it's the Department of Energy. I was going to say like the differences from state to state or from, you know what I mean? Because I imagine that comes up where it's like you have all these different sort of vernacular that's used or definitions that are used even across. I assume that would be true. I don't know if it's true in this specific case, but.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I have found it to be more true by domain and by type of expertise. I have found it to be less true. I've seen there to be less geographic variation, at least within the U.S. than I have.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Between different sectors.
Okay. I mean, that's probably good. Nice.
It is. I mean, it means that that's the axis on which you need to be really worried about your communication strategies.
Well, it's good to at least know your axis.
Well, I mean, you could sort of think about it from conferences, right? We go to all of these professional conferences and we all have a shared language, and that's why people like going to them. Yeah. Those shared languages, that's part of why government and governance is so hard, is because what you're actually doing there is bringing together people from a lot of different sectors and expecting them to all drive toward the same outcomes from very different from a lack of a shared understanding, right? But very different understanding about how the world works and how we talk about the world.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
So many different
Well,
layers, right?
so many different layers of it. Yeah. And in my world, I'm usually so involved within a particular business, and GDPR and regulation is very sort of secular and
Yeah.
um, siloed. But in this conversation and the previous conversations I've had with you, it really opens up my mind to how much bigger the data story is from a able to respond to humankind. And I mean, of course, COVID influenced that greatly as well, because it was like we saw it unfold. We were not very good at responding to that for many reasons, but one of them was absolutely the access to good data, and being able to translate these things. And so, do you think do you think that we're moving in the right direction as a country, I guess, and at least the United States? Maybe it's different in other countries, but in terms of, I mean, our company is I work for a European country, right? So we're very GDPR compliant, thankfully. But I'm just curious what you think about the evolution of this thinking, and how you think it might be evolving, and being pushed forward, whether that be purely here in the United States or in the United States and other countries, or what are you thinking about that?
And you mean back on the data policy side?
Sorry. Yeah, I think so. I'm kind of meaning the whole thing, like the ability to address public emergencies this way. That's like outcome based. This idea of being more outcome based, and what needs to be put in place for that. And I know that's a very large goal, but I'm just curious, like, if you envision how you envision that moving forward.
What I can tell you is, when I'm having these conversations, there was space for the symposium that we had last month, right? There is appetite for the discussion. There's appetite for the conversation. It's so early in the pandemic, one of the things I remember, the break point where all of a sudden I heard on the nightly news a discussion of an epidemiological model and the R value parameter.
Right.
Dropped my jaw.
I kind of did too. I was like, oh my gosh,
this is amazing. We're having these conversations in the public sphere,
yeah, right,
about complex modeling of a public health, of an infectious disease and a public health issue.
Right.
Whoa. Yeah. There are myriad things that we could have done a whole lot better with the COVID response.
Yeah.
There are also a lot of scenarios where that went a whole heck of a lot worse. Right? I mean, if we also think about the really powerful uses of data, we had a vaccine in a year.
Yeah. I remember, oh my gosh, I remember when it first, we were talking years before the vaccine initially, right? Because that would be more likely, I guess.
Well, that's the only scenarios we had, right?
Yeah.
It's one of these things where the turn on the data and the data sharing and our ability to get those data into the hands of the right people and then get them acted on, and this whole body of scientific work that had been going on for 50 years. It's not like this was the start of a vaccine generation, or a vaccine development strategy. But the fact that we were able to turn the crank that quickly is a huge statement of success. The fact that we were able to get those physically made and deployed in the world was a massive success that we could never have imagined, right? I mean, for all the things that did go poorly, there were also some huge points of success that were actually very driven by very effective uses of data in these contexts. Similarly, I think as we start thinking about what is next, and the reason I pull that example forward is, in the last 4 weeks, I have heard whole segments on comic shows about AI. Right? I mean, we're talking about this massive shift where, we were still joking about our parents not knowing how to turn on a computer.
Yeah.
And suddenly, the only thing you read in the newspaper right now, not the only thing, obviously, but
right, yeah.
All of a sudden we're reading about AI on the front page of the newspaper in almost every, on a semi-regular basis, right? I
Yeah.
mean, these sorts of shifts, this sort of ability of the public to engage in these conversations, our understanding and willingness to engage in discussions of what should be done, what is ethical, what does bias mean, how do we start to address this? The fact that we're having real conversations about which bias we're worried about. Nobody likes to actually talk about this, but it's a big one. We keep saying, oh, you have to be unbiased. Well, by whose measure?
Sure. Yeah.
Biased. I mean, we are all biased. We know that. The world is deeply biased.
Yeah.
Which of that bias do we think is acceptable or right? Who makes those decisions? How does that get implemented? It's not, they're actually, there is no sort of a priori, physics law of the world that says this is what bias means.
Yeah. Right.
Right?
Totally.
It's not gravity. It's not a constant.
Well, and it's interesting too, just to add a little note to that, because you see, as those things have been emerging, even the conversations around the pandemic, and people, like one example I can think of is people sort of misunderstanding the results of vaccines and what it meant, right? Did it mean the likelihood of getting sick or the likelihood of getting less sick, right? That differentiation became a big, and that goes back to your point about definitions and what we're talking about and how to like transcend that barrier, right? Because now with people being interested, I think, and it being more in the forefront, I think that will have a lot of positive impacts on the world, but it can also create some confusion that creates these divides and all other kinds of issues when we're unable to effectively communicate.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, and I think this gets back to really effective communication in English, right?
Yeah.
And translation between communities. One of the big issues that we ran into is that, when you put a bunch of scientists, me included, I'm just as bad, in front of the public, we've been trained our entire careers to never say a single thing with absolute certainty.
Yeah, right? Yeah.
I mean, it's antithetical to the scientific approach, right? The scientific method says you never have an answer. The scientific method says you come up with a question, you test a hypothesis, and you figure out what's wrong about that hypothesis. If you're lucky, you'll find some things that are right about it also. But what we actually are trained to then do,
constraints, right?
Well, even more than that, we're actually trained as scientists to focus on the part that we didn't know, the part that we still don't know, right? It's like, because the most interesting thing is the part that we don't know. It's like, so we double click on that immediately and we're like, yeah, but we don't know this.
Yeah, right.
And that's a real strength of the scientific method. It's a terrible method of risk communication.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I remember when I was in my PhD program, and I actually was going to school for doing a lot of work in groundwater modeling, right? And one of the classes I had to take was literally around how do you appear in court and talk about this in a way that you're both being scientifically accurate and being meaningful. But my point is that it's a graduate level class, and it was probably one of the hardest ones I took because I'm like, being able to speak that way is a big challenge. Yeah,
it really is. Yeah. Well, and in emergency management, for example, we're trained a lot of the messaging, and the same thing is true in law enforcement. You state you state absolutes.
Yeah.
You state it is statements of what you have to do. There is no wiggle room. It is authoritative. It is top down. It is, and that's by intent, right? That's not by accident. And then you put a bunch of scientists on CNN.
Yeah.
Whether someone should get a vaccine or not. Are caveats, right? And it's like, so it's just, again, it's the translation issue. So I think all of these things are tackleable, but the way that you tackle them is actually by getting really clear on what you're trying to accomplish, what the content, and get really specific about your context. There are times when the most, and in good risk communication, depending on the context, actually communicating the uncertainty is one of the most important things you can do. But how you communicate that can have a huge
impact. I guess too, right? Because, yeah.
Well, I mean, I think it was a fair statement to say everyone should get vaccinated.
Mm-hmm.
And there are also things where we can say the best information we have currently is that this is being spread primarily by aerosol or by air, right? And
Yeah.
therefore, given the fact that we have very few other medical countermeasures or any medical countermeasures at the time, but any other sort of protection values, everyone needs to wear a mask.
Mm-hmm.
And then the fact that we didn't have N95s for everybody or even surgical masks, we said, wear a mask you can, right? You got a cloth mask, great, wear that.
Yeah.
But then when that shifted and we now said, oh, hey, cloth masks, we're really glad you wore them. They were way better than nothing. They're still way better than nothing, but you now have access to something better. So please wear these instead. That messaging came across as, oh, see, they didn't know what they were talking about when they said cloth masks.
Right. Yeah.
They put us at risk by telling us to wear cloth masks. Well, no, it was a whole lot safer than no mask.
Yeah. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
But, and so again, it's sort of how do we talk about that uncertainty? How do we communicate a change in conditions, and how do we communicate a change in understanding?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. In lots of the conversations I've been in throughout my career, I find that there's been many people who are not scientifically minded, they're trying so hard to get me to say a concise answer. And I'm struggling to not give them a concise answer. And it's like this stalemate that we're in, right?
Well, it gets back to the so what statement. It's like,
oh yeah,
we hear you. So what?
Right.
What am I supposed to do with them?
Yeah. And I think and when I've been able to actually like move things forward, I think it's when you can find the right collaboration that can get you to that point where you're like, okay, so a scientist who's willing to understand that there's an outcome you're trying to achieve, and how do you give a best recommendation for that outcome, and a partner who's also understanding of the uncertainty and the fact that that's part of the story. Yeah, that's tough.
Cross-disciplinary collaboration.
Yeah.
Well, I remember it's the name of the game. There are people who do nothing but study risk communications, right? I mean, amazing. Wow, we all need a lot more training by then. It just turns out that most people who spend, years learning how to pipette things in a lab typically don't spend a lot of time with people who study risk communications for a living.
Yes, yeah. Oh my gosh, no kidding. Yeah. I know. I remember when I went to when I was going to school, I went to college for about 11 years, and that whole time it was like I actually first started in ecology, and then I moved into geology and chemistry, and I'm like, but the movement was largely because of this this increasing realization of interdisciplinary overlap, right? Because all of the things I studied had major overlap. At the basis of it was probably math and physics, which is where you start out. But anyway, I'm going on a big old tangent. But as I've gotten older, because that feels like a long time ago, it feels like it's getting even wider and more complicated, which I guess is to be expected, right? As humankind grows. So.
Yeah, well, and as we generate progressively more data versions of this world abstraction or abstraction of the world, these systems are actually uniquely good at doing that sort of cross-disciplinary integration.
Yeah.
And I think that's really powerful, and it's a really neat thing, right? The data systems that we've designed and built pull from policy data. I mean, policies were never designed to be data, right? And so
no kidding.
We're taking laws and we're taking legal language, and we're finding ways to define them in both structured and unstructured ways, but define them in ways that then can be merged with more quantitative data types. And that sort of integration is something that we can, I think, do, test, evaluate, figure out what's going to work and what isn't in a data context, and then bring that back to the human communities from which it comes, and actually have a much stronger foundation and a stronger framework for how to have those human-to-human interactions as well. So I think we can get a lot of strength from both directions of that.
Yeah, that seems so powerful, and it starts to get us into the direction of being prepared rather than reactive in a lot of these emergency situations, which we're trying more and more to be. So anyway, very great conversation. Just, kind of love these conversations where it tips my brain on its head a little bit, which is what this one was. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me about all this.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.